For months now, demonstrators have been flooding Iraqi streets. They are protesting corruption, the failures of Iraq's political system, and the Iranian influence. Iraq's government has responded with force. The United Nations Special Envoy to Iraq says that more than 500 people have been killed so far, 19,000 more wounded. So Joshua Keating is a staff writer for Slate, focusing on international affairs, and he's joining us now to discuss Iraq's worsening political crisis, and perhaps one of the worst in years. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Great to be here.
So we have covered a lot of protests really across the globe this year. It's really a remarkable time. And Iraq among the most intense. We're talking about people killed, many people imprisoned. The government has been very, very heavy-handed. Give us an overview of the crisis that Iraq is currently facing. How did this get started?
Well, I mean, it started a few months ago with economic demands originally. I mean, it began in sort of areas outside Baghdad, less developed areas of the country, and people were really looking for jobs, for more funding for social services. And as we've seen in many other parts of the world, these sort of very specific localized grievances went through what social scientists call the scale shift and became much bigger and more kind of universal and more about values. Mm-hmm. And as you said, it sort of took on the larger corruption of the system and the influence of Iran, which is very considerable in the Iraqi political system.
And how has the government responded?
Well, recently we saw the prime minister offer to resign, but that has not stopped the protests. And this is, again, a thing that we've seen in several countries in the Middle East, where perhaps, a kind of lesson held over from the Arab Spring, where people don't just want the leader to resign and if the same corrupt political system is going to remain in place.
And has the government response been also pretty heavy-handed?
Absolutely. I mean, according to human rights groups, there have been hundreds of people killed, up to 500. And I think they may be sort of taking their cues from Iran's response to its own protests, where we've seen, hundreds, maybe thousands of people killed. So, human rights groups have been very concerned about the kind of scenes we've been seeing on the Iraqi streets.
Yeah, so you point out, the protests that have been happening in Iran, and it occurred to me that there are a lot of similarities, not just with the way the government is responding, but, in Iran it had to do with the hike in the price of fuel. And as I understand it, but this is your area, another thing that's sort of particularly unique in Iran that it seems to be happening in Iraq as well is that the protesters are really from all segments of society, a real cross-section, not just sort of the educated who might find themselves being particularly suppressed by the government, but we're talking about the working class all the way up or taking to the streets.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, as I said, it sort of begins with like these, a rise in fuel prices creates a spark. And that begins the protests. And then once the government responds to that, then that then creates a cycle where people's larger grievances about the political system come into play. I mean, Iran's economy is really struggling, partly because of U.S. sanctions. A lot of people object to Iran sort of projecting its power abroad and sponsoring militias in places like Yemen, like Iraq, like Lebanon, rather than sort of funding their own domestic projects. So I think foreign policy really comes into play here too. So what begins with fuel prices, and we've seen this in several countries in Latin America as well, becomes a sort of larger opportunity for society to vent frustration with a political system that they don't think is really to people's grievances.
And you mentioned that the government in Iran, or rather Iraq, may be sort of ripping a page out of the playbook for the government in Iraq, right? That in terms of being very, very heavy-handed with the protesters are sort of similar. Are the protesters in either country also sort of inspiring each other?
That's a little hard to say. I mean, the thing about Iran is it's very kind of isolated, and it's a very sort of self-contained media environment. But no doubt, as we saw in the Arab Spring a few years ago, countries are keeping an eye on each other. We've seen massive protests in Lebanon too. The leaders of Algeria and Sudan have been forced to step down in the past year. So we're really seeing a level of protest across the Middle East that we haven't seen since the Arab Spring in 2011. And certainly those movements are kind of responding to each other.
So then what is the next step for Iraq? Where does Iraq go from here?
Well, it's hard to say, because they haven't even taken up the kind of basic reform that their president is suggesting, which would kind of limit the power of political parties and some of the corruption and sectarianism that goes along with that. So clearly, just the prime minister resigning is not going to be enough. People want structural change, and this, like many of the other protests we're seeing around the world, is a kind of leaderless movement, and that can be a strength because it makes it harder to put down these protests by or just targeting certain central figures, but it also means these movements are less likely to compromise. They're as long as the kind of most militant factions of the protests are unsatisfied, the turmoil is going to continue.
Yeah. Joshua, I'd love to have you on to talk about sort of all of the protests that we've seen popping up around the world, whether it's South America, the Middle East, China. I think there are a lot of comparisons and a really good conversation to be had. But for now, Joshua Keating, thank you so much.
Thank you.